In the axial skeleton, we have cranial bones, which consist of the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, which also contains the external occipital protuberance that marks attachment of a ligament that stabilizes the vertebrae for the neck, and this is right here, the external occipital protuberance. We also have the temporal, right here, bone, and those are the cranial bones. In addition to the cranial bones, we also have the temporomandibular joint, which would be right about here, where the temporal bone and the mandible connect so that we can move our jaw. We also have the mastoid process right here in this area, and down here we have the styloid process, is that little notch right there. We also have the external acoustic meatus, which is this little area right here. And finally, we have the squamous part, which is right about here. In the orbit, we have what is called the superior orbital fissure, which allows cranial nerves that control eye movements to enter. It is about right here in our skeleton. So there would be an opening right about here that would allow for cranial nerves to pass through. Taking another look at the inferior view of the cranial interior, we're going to point out the lesser and greater wing of this sphenoid. This would be the lesser wing right here. This down here would be the greater wing. We are also going to point out the optic canal, which is right here in this area, these areas right here. And those allow for optic nerves to pass to the eye. We also have the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica, and where this is this middle region right here, and this is the seat of saddle and is the deepest part of the sella turcica, known as the hypophyseal fossa, and it holds the pituitary gland. Now we're going to focus on the ethmoid bone, and in this bone we're going to point out two structures, and the first one is the crista galli, and that is this protrusion right here, and this structure helps secure the brain in the cranial cavity. We also have the cribriform plate, and it is punctured, so the cribriform plate would lie underneath the crista galli, and this structure is punctured by tiny holes, and it is called the cribriform foramina, that it allows filaments of the olfactory nerves to pass through from smell receptors in the nasal cavity to the brain. Now I would like to point out a few of the sutures that are seen on the skull that make up a few of the cranial bones. And the first one that we're going to point out is this suture right here that fuses the frontal bone with the parietal, which are right here on either side. And these make up the frontal bone. The next suture that I'm going to talk about is the sagittal, which is this one right in the middle right here. And these are made up by the left and right parietal bones. The next suture is the lambdoid suture, and this one can be found right here, and it is made up from the occipital bone and the parietal bone. And the last one that we are going to talk about is the squamous, and that is, we're missing it, I believe, but it would typically be right in this area right here, separating the parietal from the temporal bone down here. Now we're going to focus on the facial bones, and the first one I'm going to point out is the maxilla, which is right here, which would be considered the upper lip, and the alveolar process are the teeth. And then the cheekbones, or the zygomatic bone, is made up by the zygomatic process and the squamous part, and that is located right here. The zygomatic bone makes up our cheekbones. The next one is the ethmoid bone, and that is in the inner cavity of the eye. So that would be seen in here, right towards the inner corner of the eye. We also have the vomer, which is this bone inside of the nasal cavity, a portion of this bone in the nasal cavity. And the nasal septum is formed by the ethmoid bone and the maxilla, so both of these bones help to make up this structure in the middle. We have the inferior nasal concha, which can be found right inside of the nasal cavity. In our structure, it'd be kind of hard to see, but it would be right about on this side. You can see a slight protrusion. And so for the inferior nasal concha, we form the nasal cavity by holding open it holds open the passageways, allowing easy flow of air in and out while we're breathing. The primary vertebrae are the thoracic and the sacral, whereas the cervical and the lumbar are secondary. For the cervical vertebral column, we have the atlas up here, and this structure allows for us to do things like nod our head yes, and then the atlas is followed by the axis, and the following 7 vertebrae are all part of the cervical column. Column has a unique aspect about it. These little structures right about here, they are called the transverse process, and the transverse process in the cervical vertebrae is different from the other sections of the vertebral column, because each transverse process contains a transverse foramen, and through these foramen, vertebral arteries pass and they service the brain. The thoracic column, which begins right after after the cervical column ends, and similarly to our rib cage, we have 12 ribs, and just as such, we have 12 vertebrae in this vertebral column. And so I wanted to point out the spinous process, which is this these structures right here, and I also wanted to point out the transverse process on these, because they are shaped differently than the ones in the cervical. They kind of adhere to the rib cage. The intervertebral foramen is not quite seen, but so right here in the rib cage, so it would be this structure right here, that would be the intervertebral foramen, and this foramen allows for spinal nerves from the spinal cord to pass through. So the body of the thoracic column is this structure right here, and the position of the intervertebral discs are circular in the thoracic column. And these are the in intervertebral discs. So in the remaining vertebral column, we have the remaining 5 vertebrae, and these are called the lumbar, and part of the lumbar is the sacrum, which is 5 fused vertebral columns. Then we have the coccyx, which is also known as the tailbone, and that is this structure right here. The last focus will be on the sternum. Well, I should say second to last, because we're going to go over the ribs later. So first I wanted to point out that this is the body of the sternum right here, and the manubrium is this top portion, which is cut off at this kind of indent right here. Then we have the xiphoid process, and the xiphoid process is this little structure down here. The jugular notch is the structure I pointed out that separates the body from the manubrium. The next portion of the video will concentrate on the ribs, and the true ribs, or the vertebral sternal, are the first 7 that connect to the sternum and the vertebral column. Then we have a set of what are called false ribs, and these are called the vertebral chondral, and these are the remaining 8 through 12 ribs that either connect to the upper ribs from cartilage or do not kind of float in the air as such. Then we have the head, neck, and tubercle of the rib, and this is so we have the head of the rib, which would be connected to the vertebral column. So this would be right here in this area. Let me focus my camera for you. So these would be considered the head of rib, and the neck of the rib is the curvature that we see as the ribs kind of form a curve around the internal organs, as they would be if they were inside. And then we have the tubercle of the rib, and that is the kind of small ridge on the bottom, if you can kind of see that right there. So those are the important aspects of the rib, and so I'd like to point out that the ribs, ribs 1 and ribs 10 through 12 articulate with only one vertebral body, while ribs 11 and 12 do not articulate with a vertebral transverse process.